I know that Andy and I have plenty to share. So we'll begin with a prayer as we gather ourselves together at this moment in this sacred space and time and internet connection from many different parts of the areas on this continent, and we give thanks for this. So let us pray. Creator God, Shatrat Shadiya Nayot, thank you for your loving grace and for your compassion, for your kindness, and for this blessing of a new day. Thank you for all the elements that you bless us with earth, with fire, with wind, with water. Thank you for this sacred space and time. We give you thanks for all those who are here with us and all those who are making their way to get onto this Zoom meeting, this teaching. We just give you thanks for the opportunity to be of service in this way and continue to guide us in our mind, in our thinking, in our thoughts, planning, in our hearts. And all this we ask in your name, Lord Christ. Amen. Okay, so Cornelia Eaton Yinshih Ashihin Ashlin Hashlishni Bashichin Nakadene Dashanalid Laschi Edashache Egit Yaha Son Nishle. So I am Cornelia Eaton. I serve here in the Episcopal Church in Navajo Land as canon to the ordinary and as well as the program director here in the Hozho Center where I am today. So I'm very grateful to be here with you. I'm Salt Clan, which is my mother's clan, and I'm Mud Clan, which is my dad's side of the clan, and Ushchi is Red Cheek, Red Bottom clan, which is my maternal grandfather's clan, and then I'm Nakai Dene, which is my paternal grandmother's clan, so paternal grandmother's clan, and so recently I discovered that Nakai Dene, there's a difference between how that is said. I've learned that at first Nakai Dene is the Mexican clan. Nakai Dene is the one who came back from Huelde clan. So my ancestors are the ones who've come back from Fort Sumner, from the place of suffering, and they are my paternal grandmother's clan, and that's very profound, because I carry a history in my body, in my being, and so when I carry this history, and all of the Ne people carry history. They carry the history of our ancestors' survival from the Fort Sumner, going to Huelda, as in the early 1868 or 1864, I believe it was, being rounded from this sacred space within the four sacred mountains. And so today, as we have a conversation about the four sacred mountains, I began with the sacred mountain from the east, which is Cisnagini, White Shell Mountain, which is located in Alamosa, Colorado. And then I went to Sontzith, which is Mount Taylor, which where Andy could see from her home, and I do get pictures from time to time about I get to see some through a text message. So and and that's Turquoise Mountain, and we've talked a little bit about that at our last session. And then we talked about, and today is going to be on Dog Slid, which is the San Francisco Peaks. And San Francisco Peaks is located near Flagstaff, Arizona. So we're moving in a direction, where I'm moving. I hope that I'm helping us move in a direction where we are learning how to be relatives to one another, because we all share in a sacredness of how the earth, the creator, has provided us these things so that we can be in relationship with each other. And it doesn't not only belong to the Dene, but it belongs to all the people. And we are all the people. We are the Dene together. So that's the invitation of being interrelated, interdependent, relationship, if you will. And so Dog Slid is the abalone. It represents the abalone shell. So some of us wear abalone shell from time to time. I do have several abalone shell jewelry, and they remind me of Dog Slid when I put them on. And the abalone shell, if you've noticed that it has this really like a pearl, silver, just a mixture of all kinds of colors. And the abalone shell, you can actually, talking about the West Coast, that's where the abalone shells come from, is from the West Coast. And the white shell come from the East Coast. And so that's why the Dene know that these shells come from these places, because the Diyin, the holy people, know this, because they're everywhere. Like God is like everywhere, and so but what I also recently discovered, I have a life full of discoveries as I continue to walk the spiritual life of the spiritual values of the people. And one of the things I discovered was that the East and the West are affiliated with shells. So you have a white shell and a abalone shell. And then the South and the North are stones. There's turquoise stone, and then our next session is going to be the Northern Sacred Mountain. And that one is with abalone stone. So they're rocks. So if you think about the shells and the stones, they're relational, and they offer us some teachings, but they're very sacred to the people. So so today, as we talk about the abalone shell, the Dog Slid, it's in relationship to the twilight, to the evening. It has a relationship with offering of a corn pollen. And the West is affiliated with the color yellow. And yellow is a sacred color, because when we, in the evening, when we're beginning to settle into just our moment of being with family, and a moment of reflection, a moment of perhaps inviting our day, what was our day like, and sharing that is very symbolic. So this is a time to admire the sunset. It's a time to feel peace. It's a time where we're invited to come home. And it's a time where we find a place of centering and balancing our day, so that when we get into that centering and balancing, then we're ready for rest. But rest, I'll talk about that at our next section, our next session. So I don't want to get too ahead. So then when we think about this Dene way of relationship with the color yellow, with coming home, with sunset, with centering ourselves and balancing ourselves. We're doing this in this larger Hogan, the universe that we live in, which is the world. The Dene believe that we share this one Hogan that is our home. And this Hogan home that we share together is our centering place. So the Hogan that we live in my grandmother's lived in, there's an eastern doorway where we walk in, and that's the only doorway that we come in. There's no back door. There's no side door. There's just the one door that we walk in from, and that's from the eastern doorway. That's from the dawn way. And so when we go in, we walk around, and in the center of the Hogan is the fire. It's where the potbelly stove sits. It's where we get our warmth. It's where we cook our meals. It's where we gather around the sacred fire. So that centering fire represents the soul of this sacred home, and it speaks to us. So those of you who have maybe a fireplace or a wood stove in your home, and you're beginning to gather your wood together and beginning to start fire, you hear those crackling sounds. Sometimes it's gentle. Sometimes it really crackles, like bam, bam. And one time I was starting in the morning, I was beginning to start the morning fire in the fireplace. And one day it started sparkling, and the spark started to jump at me. And I'm like, wait a minute, what's going on here? And when we talk to the fire, it means that sometimes there's some sort of attention that it needs. And so talking to and praying and giving gratitude, maybe sometimes when that happens to me, I find that maybe I'm not grateful for something. Maybe I'm not tending to something that I'm supposed to be, paying attention to. So those kinds of thoughts begin to happen for me, and it helps me to learn to be in relationship spiritually, and it helps me to also recenter myself with gratitude, because gratitude is the very heart of being respectful, being reverent to nature. So gratitude then helps us to realize that these important sacred things are part of our spirituality. And then we're able to see clearly about what the next things are for us. So today, as I speak on a little bit about all this, I invited my friend Andi, who I got to know many years ago. I think more than a decade ago. I was an undergrad and Andi, I met Andi in my undergrad, and she was actually she's my professor, and I took a Native American literature, and this course basically opened my eyes to Navajo poetry and Navajo stories. And so I'm grateful that she encouraged me to write my stories the way I understood my stories. And it's different for many. And so I would say that's how some of my writing birthed out of this class. And so I'm very grateful, and I'm grateful to invite Andi back, and I'm grateful that she's accepted. And Andi is also a poet and an author of several books and poetry books. So, and I welcome you, Andi, to this session. And the reason I invited Andi into all this is because that what I've just shared so far is about Hozho, that whole coming to the Western direction now, and it's time for family, it's time for sharing, but it's also a time where we're invited to hear other stories. And I wanted to bring in Andi and to share her stories and her spiritual connection to Shalom. Because I think I remember one time when I first met Andi, at first I thought she was native. Well, like but then later I found out I've learned that she was from Jesus's clan. So and so I wanted to invite her into this conversation because that's the whole interconnection, the intertwining of how Hozho is all about. And so Hozho and Shalom have a relationship and they're intertwined. And so this is where I will invite Andi to share with us some of the stories that you have for us. So yeah.
Cornelia, it's good to be here with you. I think you were in my class 2000, so it's been 20 years. We have a history. And as Cornelia put it, Jesus's clan, which means that I'm Jewish, my lineage all back as far as we know. And so there are several things I'm just gonna share. And if you have questions along the way, you're welcome to ask them too. But some of the things that Cornelia's already talked about, like Hozho, that concept. In Hebrew, the word is shalom. And similar to the word in Arabic, salam. And the greeting in Hebrew is shalom aleichem. And if you're greeted that way, then your response is aleichem shalom. And so it's similar in Arabic, salam aleikum, aleikum assalam. And that is very similar to be with you and also with you. So it's an expression and it can be used as a like shalom, aloha, and it is used that way quite a bit, but it has a deeper meaning. And some of the words associated with shalom are peace, harmony, wholeness, well-being, completeness, prosperity, tranquility. So as you can see, it's more complex than English, akin to the Dene concept of Hozho, peace and harmony. Another thing that Corn mentioned was talking about this time of year and the sunset, and that brings to mind that Jewish holidays that we celebrate, like the Passover, as communion, bread and the wine. When we celebrate Passover or any of the high holy days, the New Year, the Day of Atonement, the day begins at sunset. So if you on your calendar, the first day of Passover, March 25th, it actually begins March 24th. So the evening and the morning to the next evening is one day. And that commemorates God's creation. So it started at night, started with nothingness, And then God said, let there be light. And there was morning and evening, evening and morning. That's a day. Let's see what else. Cornelia talked about light and the Hozho in the stove in the center of the fire, in the center of the Hozho. And light is very important in the Jewish tradition. Jewish people like candles for a lot of reasons. If someone has died and we're commemorating the anniversary of their death, at a certain kind of if we're celebrating Hanukkah, the Festival of Lights, which is, but there's a Jewish calendar that's different from the Christian calendar. So different months, and it's more of a lunar calendar. The year begins in March with the Passover. That's kind of the beginning, spring, and the celebration of the Passover, which I'll talk about in a minute. But I was talking about light, and at Hanukkah, you probably know the story, but it's not in the Bible. So Jews have a long history, many stories that the Old Testament is just the beginning of stories. And one of those stories is about when the Jews had a temple, a place where they worshiped, and there was a light in the temple burning all the time that symbolized the constant presence of. And the Greeks came into the area, and there's conflict between the Greeks and the Jews. And the Greeks the soldiers came into the temple and destroyed much of it because it represented a religion that was not the Greek religion at the time. And one of the things that they destroyed was the stockpile of oil that was used to keep the lamp continually burning. So the miracle was that the Jews had to reconsecrate the temple, and they needed to have lighting, but it wouldn't take several days for new oil to be brought. And the light that they had was only enough for a night and a day, but it ended up burning for 8 days, which was enough time to get more oil. So that is the great miracle that happened here, is the miracle of the lights, which is why we candles and why we celebrate. And every night that we light, that candle has a particular meaning. One night it might be justice, and you light the candle, talk about justice. Another is murder. So these they're all lit by the center candle, which is called the servant candle. And so there's a lot of symbolism there that Christians also take into Christianity, because Jesus was a Jew. There are a lot of cultural traditions that continue on. And Christians, a lot of parallels between Christian belief in Jesus as the Savior, Jesus as the prophet, Jesus as the Messiah, the promised one that the Jews were looking for in peace. And so the serpent candle, you think about Jesus being the servant of God. So that's part of the connection with light. Passover, which you know as communion in the Christian tradition, and it's based on Jesus celebrating the feast of Passover with his disciples before his crucifixion. And that's the reason why they had bread and wine as part of the ceremony of Passover. And Passover is when the angel of death passed over the Jews' homes in Egypt. They marked their homes according to what God told them to do, slaughtered a lamb, used as sacrifice, used the blood of the lamb, put it on the doorpost, and the angel of death killed the firstborn of all the Egyptians. Old Testament's a little violent. And God said, I will spare you if you have the blood. The angel of death will not kill any Hebrew firstborn. So the angel of death passed over, so it's Passover. And in the book of Exodus, you can read the account of the Passover, of the Jews being freed from 400 years of slavery in Egypt. Oh, is it breaking up? Sorry. Okay, I'm gonna move my computer and maybe see if that's better. Okay. So let's see, Passover. And the reason the bread and the wine, God had told them, slaughter a lamb, roast the lamb, and eat it, but also you're going to take some of that with you. You're going to put together your dough for the bread, but you're doing it in a hurry. There's no time for yeast to let it rise, so just put it together, flour and water, basically. Take it with you, because when you leave Egypt, you're going to be on your own for a little while. And so you're going to need that stockpile of lamb and of bread. So when the Jews got out of Egypt through the Red Sea, probably know that story, Moses, and they went to bake their bread, the bread was just flat, right? Because it had no yeast, no such thing as baking soda then, or baking powder. So the bread was flat, and that's why Jews eat matzah, flat bread. And that is why in some Christian traditions, the wafers for communion are flat. In other Christian traditions, it's leavened bread, yeast bread, that you break and share, because in the Christian tradition, God sends Jesus to be the new covenant. So the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, Jesus is the new covenant. And as we know from the Bible, old things are passed away, all things become new. So Jesus is, as the promised Messiah, steps into this role to be the face of God on earth. and to show us a way that doesn't require animal sacrifices anymore, doesn't require God to swoop in and kill the firstborn of our enemies. So there's all this newness that comes in with the New Testament, with Jesus. So there are parallels between Jewish tradition and Christian tradition, because Christianity is born literally out of Judaism. What else can I tell you? Oh, in terms of the Hogan and family gathering around as a family is really important in Jewish tradition. So all Jewish ceremonies, even though we have a synagogue and people go to pray and to worship together at the synagogue, the ceremonies really focus around family. And the Passover ceremony also is long, eight nights of Passover, but the first night is the most important, and that's when all the stories are told of God getting us out of the land of Egypt. One more thing I want to say, Cornelia talked about Dineh and the people, and most tribal peoples around the world, and the Jews' word tribe, have a sense of themselves as the people, which is what Dineh means. And Jews happen to have the sense of themselves as the chosen people, because that's the tradition. That's what God said. I've chosen you to be a light unto the world, which should sound familiar to you from Christian tradition. So the whole idea of chosen people, it's had different interpretations over the years. And really, Orthodox Jewish people really see it as, this is it, we're the chosen people, you're not. And over the years, it's that belief has become moderated, that Jews are chosen to do certain things in the world, just like Dineh are chosen to do certain things in the world. Every people is a chosen people. Every people has its cultural values and norms. And a rabbi from years ago said that Jews just have a talent for a separate identity. And it's part of our survival. It's part of why we could be wiped out in the Holocaust and still be around. It's part of why we could be enslaved in Egypt for many years and 400 years and still be around. Our traditions, our families really keep us alive and vibrant as a culture. And another rabbi said that the Jews carry with them a unique asset, which is a vivid consciousness of their past. So even though I am not currently a practicing Jew, and at one time I was a practicing Christian, so that's a story for another time, I have a very strong sense, and always have had, of being Jewish. Just like Cornelia knows she's Dineh and belongs to Dinetah. And for me, it's not so much about land or place. For many Jews it is. They look at Israel like that's our place. But for me, it's really more of that shared history with my people. And my people come from Eastern Europe, which, as you know, is in a mess right now. So my ancestors come from Ukraine. My grandfather was born in Poland. They're from Lithuania and Latvia, and made their way through those countries as merchants and traders, not traitors, but traders. And many of them made their way to England, which was part of what my family did, and then to the United States. Some of them ended up in Germany, some of them got out, some of them didn't. So that's how I feel connected. Feel very connected to my ancestry, even though I don't have a specific clan. And the whole idea of Jesus's clan, I'll just share one more thing, and then hand it over to Cornelia and Ken. So when I first lived on the Navajo reservation in Pinon, Arizona, we were missionaries with Navajo Gospel Mission. And the family we lived near, Navajo pastor and his wife and 5 kids, I think, they were really curious about, well, how come white people never talk about their clans when you introduce yourselves? What's your identity if your citizenship is American, but like, what's your identity? And so the kids were asking me a lot of questions, and I shared a lot of this with them, that my people, the children of Israel, go way, way back, many centuries before Jesus. We talked a lot about the stories. And I said, many, many years later, 2 of those Jewish people were Mary and Joseph. And so they were Jewish, and their son Jesus was born to them. If your mother's a Jew, you're a Jew. So Jesus was Jewish. And one of the kids suddenly said, "Oh, I get it." And everybody was like, what do you get? And he said, "Andi's from Jesus's clan." And that's always been very special to me, to be from Jesus's clan. So my people are really the descendants of Jacob's sons, the 12 tribes of Israel. And then the Navajo pastor Nelson said, "Oh, so you're an enrolled tribal member." So that is, I feel like, is my connection to tribal culture. I'll just stop there. Cornelia.
Yes, the Donna Yat Yat is very, very good. Thank you.
Mhm.
Yeah, as you can see, you may wonder how we might have connected. We had many similarities, and I think our our cross passing was a gift from Dian the Holy. And I'm very grateful that today we're still able to have this relationship and to laugh. And I mean, we can laugh. And we've been through ceremonies together, and to just really be a part of a ritual that really brings us together. And I think that what you said about tradition and families keep us alive. This is part of the teachings of the 4 sacred directions, the 4 sacred mountains, the 4 sacred colors, all those things that are our tradition, and that is intertwined with families, and that help us keep us alive, and to nurture our very spirituality. And that's Hozho, that brings us together into this peace and balance of connection. And it also brings us a connection of how to live a good life through our own prayer, our knowledge, what we learn, what we don't know, and then what we well know, in time and I know that I truly believe that God makes certain things known to us when we're ready, when we've perhaps matured into that, to that next thing that God has for us. And it's all a teaching and it's all experience, experiences get us to where we are today. And then how do we give back these experiences to the world that perhaps has lost these tradition, these values, these families, and really about the Western direction, about being this place of wisdom where it helps us to restore those holistic parts of ourselves, of our being. And so at this time, I think I would, be open to questions, if you have any for me and Andi, and that we would be able to answer any questions that you might have for us. And Andi put in the chat that another rabbi said Jews are a small people with a large experience. So, I was thinking when Andi talked about the exile, right? And going through that and preparing the meal that you were gathered. This is what's going to help you get through. It made me think about a time where I actually wrote down, I think, roast mutton and tortillas and all that. And I remember one time when back in my younger days, my paternal grandmother, when we were ready to go on a long trip to maybe Albuquerque or somewhere, they would always pack roast. They would boil mutton the night before, and then in the morning they would pack all these roast mutton. They would pack bread. They would pack all these foods in a bluebird material. They would put everything inside the bluebird material. And if you think that a bluebird flour bag, that the bag, why we preserve them and save them, because we packed our food in it and we rolled it up. And I remember them putting them in a bag, and as we went to another place that was not familiar, along the way we would stop maybe by the Continental Divide up there, and we would just pull off to the side of the road, and we would sit and make a picnic area and sit underneath the juniper bushes, the juniper trees, and we would just sit in nature and sit on the ground and lay out a blanket, and my grandmas would bring all the food out, and we would eat cold mutton. And boy, just talking about it, my tummy just started growling. And we
tastes like home.
Yeah, and we would just eat, and they had coffee in little canisters, and we just shared all that. And I remember also that it was just like home, like back in the tradition. When my grandparents used to live in the Hogan, and they would bring food outside of the Hogan during the springtime or summertime, and lay a blanket outside of the Hogan, and we would bring all the food out there, and we would just sit out there. And now, as I remember about all that in my own experience this past couple of years, getting very grounded with nature and earth, our earth mother, Nahastan Shema, my mother, and sitting on her lap and not knowing what these past couple of years were going to be like, but knowing that I was able to sit on my grandmother, on my mother, on my Shema Nahastan, and sit there. And now I know what that meant for them, for our elders, for the people, when they go outside and sit on Shema Nahastan to reconnect, so that they're able to feel that embrace, and they're able to feel her compassion. And this compassion is very loving, because our earth mother today still suffers for us, but she's still generous and loving, and she still prays for us and provides for us all these things that we have today. And those are very profound, and in our own way, we become emotionally, spiritually, physically, and mentally healed. And when we turn to that, and I think the Dene have such a deep gift of how to do that, that oftentimes we forget to learn how to be in relationship with our surroundings. Because once we learn how to treat these elements with respect and reverence, then we know how to treat each other with respect and reverence as human people. And so these sacred stories are about that. Andi shared her story in her life, and so I often find that I think that's where the sacredness, listening to the sacred heart of God in the midst of all that, and it beats, together for us. And but anyway, I sort of went off a little bit on. So I'm open to questions, whatever, with the time that's left for us.
I'd like to say something. So by listening to both stories, what's coming up in my being is sacred threads and holy sparks.
Beautiful.
That's all.
Yeah, that's great. And I started studying Native American Lit in Flagstaff in the shadow Toko Oslit. So yeah, I've had the privilege to live within and nearby sacred mountains, and it's really special for me. And also the first time I ever had all the parts of roasted lamb, the entrails and everything, was at Cornelia's sheep camp. And this morning I was reviewing Exodus, just to see how much of the Passover story is there, because a lot of what we do on the Passover, it doesn't come straight out of the Bible. It comes from hundreds and hundreds of years of rabbis commenting, and for Jews, those rabbi comments are also sacred. The conversation about what does it all mean is sacred. And so in Exodus, God says, you're going to slaughter the lamb and you're going to use every bit of it. You don't leave anything behind. You eat everything, including the entrails, and it gets very specific. And I thought, oh yeah, that's First time I did that was at Cornelia's sheep camp. So our experiences have, yeah, just cross-pollinated, I guess.
Cross-pollinated, yeah. It corn pollened together.
Yeah.
So, yes. Well, if there's not any other questions, I would like to just offer this, that to remember that the twilight, the evening light, the holy sacred light, the holy fire, I hope that you'll able to see and embrace in a new way. And that it's a time where we gather family and we learn. We think about what positivity came out of today that we could apply it to our human relations. So that when we think and pray about all those things, and maybe after your meal and you're settling into the folding darkness night, which is the northern direction, which we will talk about the next time around, the folding darkness place, is a place of wisdom. So tonight I invite you to pray about wisdom. What was it about this conversation that will bring wisdom for you as you sleep? Because I've learned that when we sleep is when we gain some wisdom, and that that God is simmering something very special during the time when we sleep. And so we pray about what it is that God will use through you into the next day. What is it about today that God will use you into the next day? And that's how wisdom is gathered, and that's how I think our relationships are built on that. So it's a one day, not remember, it's not next week. It's not for next week. It's for tomorrow. And that's the concept of bringing Hozho, that balance, that harmony, that interrelatedness, that happiness that we long for and hope for. So I want to say thank you. And Yat-eh is incarnational. I think I've shared with many of my relatives here on this screen that Yat-eh is incarnational. It's inviting the divine to be with us, but also an invitation to you as I reach out my hand to you and say Yat-eh. So we hold each other, and that becomes incarnational. Nothing can separate this. Nothing. And so we're invited into that together as we move from here. So thank you, Andi, for joining in. I really am grateful. I hope that maybe in future times that we'll be able to offer some mini teachings along the way. And to all of you who are on the screen, thank you, and Yat-eh to you, and Hozho and blessings to you.
Shalom.
Shalom. Hozho, Go on that.
Go on that.